Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take on these dense stacks of source material, articles, historical research, scholarly notes, and we really try to distill all that complexity down into pure, actionable knowledge for you, the learner.
And our mission today is, well, it's a truly ambitious one. Our listener gave us a stack dedicated entirely to the critical, scholarly examination of the foundational texts of Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, we're talking about the Torah, the Old Testament, and the New Testament.
Right. All of it.
And so we're putting on our historian hats today. We are approaching these texts not as, theological treatises, but as ancient documents. Our goal is strictly to understand the core scholarly arguments that are presented in these sources. We're looking at authorship, textual transmission, historical accuracy, how doctrine evolved, and maybe most controversially, the claims about the influence of other pre-existing ancient religions.
It's really an exercise in critical engagement. I mean, when you're dealing with texts that span thousands of years, multiple languages, you just have to acknowledge that the journey from the original writing to the copies we read today is, well, it's incredibly complex.
Not a straight line.
Not at all. And the sources we have here suggest this journey has been far from perfect. It's introduced layers of, human influence, alteration, and even structural conflicts that really defy any simple unified explanation.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are starting right where the foundation is laid, the integrity of the Torah, and I guess the claimed authorship by Moses.
Right. So fundamentally, the Hebrew word Torah, it just translates as teaching or law.
The law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Institutionally, it refers to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the tradition, the bedrock claim, is that these were received by Moses directly from God on Mount Sinai.
And the internal narrative of the text itself seems to support that claim perfectly. I mean, the sources remind us where God commanded Moses to write the law on stone tablets.
Yes, you see that in Exodus and Deuteronomy. The transmission is presented as seamless, as divine, a perfect direct transmission from God to Moses.
And then it continues from there.
It does. We get the continuation of the story where Moses' successor, Joshua, he reportedly completes the writing and reads the entire law to the whole nation of Israel.
So it suggests a kind of perfect, unbroken chain of authority.
That's the picture it paints. However, our sources cite a very, very different scholarly consensus, and this was driven largely by 19th century German criticism.
This is where the concept of redactors comes in, right?
That's right. The scholarly consensus cited in the material, which is really rooted in what's often called the documentary hypothesis, is that the Torah was not written by Moses, not as a single author.
Okay, so if not Moses, then who and when?
The argument is that these books were compiled much, much later by anonymous scribes, editors, really, we call them redactors, and they were weaving together multiple pre-existing traditions, some oral, some written.
So if they weren't written by Moses, how can scholars even figure out when they were written? What's the evidence for this late compilation?
The evidence is manifold, really. It centers on linguistic analysis, changes in the names used for God, and the cultural context within the text itself.
So different layers of writing.
Different layers, exactly. Scholars label them J, E, D, and P. These traditions probably existed before the Babylonian exile, but the final compiled version, the one we recognize today, that was formalized after the exile, maybe 5th or 4th century BCE.
So you're saying the text is a product of human editing and systematization after this huge, catastrophic national event. It's not a direct dictation from God from millennia before.
That's the argument, precisely. And our source even gives this truly astonishing estimate from the German scholar Noldeck. He suggests the final writing of the Torah occurred approximately 900 years after Moses is believed to have lived.
900 years. That's not just a gap. I mean, that completely transforms the text from a first-hand account into a historical document reflecting the memory, the politics, the theology of a people living almost a millennium later.
It does, and we find the most direct evidence of this post-Mosaic authorship embedded right in the narratives themselves, things that are just out of time, anachronisms.
Things the writers couldn't possibly have known if they were writing in real time with Moses.
Exactly. They show knowledge that you could only have in hindsight.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting because the examples our sources give are incredibly specific. Let's look at the manna account. Exodus 16.35. It says the Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land.
Right. So for the writer to state the precise duration, 40 years, and the exact point it stopped when they entered Canaan, he had to be writing after that entire 40-year period was over.
Because the manna only stopped when Joshua entered the Promised Land.
Which happened after Moses' death. Moses, if he were recording these events as they happened, wouldn't know the future duration of the miracle. The writer's clearly looking backward, not forward.
It's like a reporter filing a story on the first day of a war, but already knowing the exact date and time the surrender documents will be signed years later. The perspective is just totally wrong for the supposed author.
And we see this same temporal mismatch with geographical place names. This really confirms that later perspective. The texts use names for places that just didn't exist until centuries after Moses' lifetime.
Okay, give us some examples. What are these anachronistic place names that scholars point to?
Well, one really clear example is in Genesis 14.13. It references the city of Dan.
Okay.
Yet our sources confirm that this city was only officially named Dan during the era of the Judges. That's long after Moses died, as you can see detailed in the book of Judges.
That's a huge tell. That's the ancient equivalent of writing a book set during the American Civil War and having a character talk about visiting Silicon Valley. It just immediately signals a future writer inserting their own contemporary geography.
Precisely. And there are more. Genesis 40.15 uses the phrase land of the Hebrews, but this was used before the Hebrews had actually settled permanently in Palestine. It's a title applied retroactively.
Looking back and naming it.
Right. And also, the text mentions Hebron in Genesis 35.27, but that city was known as Kirjath Arba before Joshua renamed it, and he renamed it Hebron during his lifetime after the Exodus. All these little details consistently point to a literary hand operating hundreds of years later, editing and unifying the stories.
So we have evidence of post-event authorship through anachronisms. Now let's look at internal contradictions, the moments where the claimed Mosaic law seems to run directly against the actions attributed to Moses or his successors, specifically regarding the conquest of Canaan.
Yes. This specific case is often used by critics as a direct example of conflicting religious instruction. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, God is quoted explicitly commanding Moses not to encroach on the land of the Ammonites.
Descendants of Lot.
Yes, this land was divinely established as off-limits.
A clear, unambiguous boundary set by God. But then the historical record in the book of Joshua seems to either completely ignore or just be unaware of this command.
It does. The book of Joshua, which is supposed to be the chronicle of the fulfillment of the law, states in chapter 13 that Moses did divide half of the Ammonite land among the tribe of Gad.
Wait a minute. So if God commanded Moses not to touch the land of the Ammonites in Deuteronomy, and then Joshua records that Moses did divide it, that means one of these foundational texts is recording something factually incorrect, either about the divine instruction or the historical action.
It raises a fundamental question about coherence, doesn't it? If these texts are a single, unified, inspired document, how can the instruction and the execution directly contradict each other?
So the contradiction suggests what? Divergent traditions that were just sort of awkwardly pasted together.
That's one possibility, that a redactor was working with different, isolated source traditions. Or it suggests a profound error in the historical record of the conquest itself.
Okay, so the human element doesn't stop with just the original authorship and compilation. The moment we look past that origin point and into how the text was transmitted, we run into the inherent instability of ancient texts, variance and copyist error. What versions are we even relying on today?
That's a huge point. Our sources highlight that even among believers, there is no single unified manuscript version. There are 3 famous ancient versions of the Old Testament texts, and each one is accepted by a different community.
First, there's the Hebrew version. That's the one used by Jews and most Protestants today.
Correct. Then there's the Greek version, known as the Septuagint. And what's fascinating here is that, historically, this Greek translation was accepted by Christians until as late as the 15th century.
And crucially, they had a different view of the Hebrew version back then.
A very different view. Christians of that era often regarded the Hebrew version, the one most widely accepted today, as textually corrupt. The fact that the accepted true text actually shifted over time is significant evidence of textual evolution.
And the third one is the Samaritan version.
Right. The Samaritans are extremely restrictive. They only accept the Pentateuch, Joshua, and Judges. And our sources emphasize that the Samaritan version contains specific extra words and phrases that you just don't find in the Hebrew version.
So these differences, whether they're additions or omissions, are direct, tangible evidence that the texts didn't descend in a single identical stream.
Exactly. They were altered and developed by their respective communities over time.
And beyond the texts that survived in these different forms, we know that entire major historical works are just missing, which speaks to the fragility of ancient record keeping.
That's a critical point about lost knowledge. The source material details the works of King Solomon mentioned in 1 Kings, his 3,000 proverbs, his 1,005 songs, and his voluminous writings on botany and zoology.
And historians agree these are just gone.
Permanently lost. Imagine if we lost the entire works of Aristotle, or every play Shakespeare ever wrote, times 10. That's the scale of loss we were talking about. It confirms that the preservation process was subject to massive human failure.
And when we look at the books that did survive, the details can be chaotic. I think we have to address the numerical and chronological errors that scholars have meticulously cataloged. These aren't just interpretive differences, they are specific data points that do not match up between books.
Yes. Let's start with the conflicting military censuses for King David. This involves massive numbers, hundreds of thousands of men that change depending on which book you're reading.
Okay, so you're comparing 2 Samuel with 1 Chronicles.
Correct. If you look at 2 Samuel 24.9, it lists 800,000 fighting men in Israel and 500,000 in Judah. So 1.3 million total.
And in Chronicles.
4 Chronicles 21.5 inflates the Israelite number to 1.1 million, and the Judah number drops a bit to 470,000. That is a difference of 300,000 men in Israel alone. The scholar Adam Clark acknowledged this historical inconsistency, and he concluded flatly that these two accounts cannot both be correct. He attributed the fault to copyists making errors in the historical books.
This isn't just trivia, this is core historical data. The sources suggest human copyist errors impacting the verifiable facts, but the chronological errors, I think, are even more devastating to the claim of infallibility because they describe literal impossibilities.
The King Asa and Baasha error is a textbook case of this. So 2 Chronicles 16.1 states that King Baasha built Ramah in the 36th year of King Asa's reign.
Okay, that sounds like a specific date. What's the problem?
The problem is that if you cross-reference that with 1 Kings 15.33, we learn that King Baasha died in the 27th year of Asa's reign.
Oh.
So the Book of Chronicles claims Baasha undertook a massive building project 9 years after his own death.
So he started building in year 36, but he was already deceased in year 27. That is not a scribal accident. That's a profound historical impossibility that just breaks the narrative.
Exactly. And the final piece of textual evidence often cited here is the nonsensical line about King Saul's accession in 1 Samuel 13.1.
That verse is truly notorious for its obvious error.
It is. The verse reads, Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign, and he reigned 2 years over Israel.
1 year old.
1 year old. It's utterly incomprehensible, given that he's described as a warrior, a father, a major political figure. It's such a clear, irreparable corruption of the original text that, as our sources note, some modern translations, like the one by the Jesuit fathers, just leave the age blank to avoid printing the absurdity.
So we've established textual corruption through transmission and compilation issues. Let's move now into history versus prophecy, where the texts run into direct opposition with known historical realities, particularly about ancient Egypt.
Right, and we should first address the prophecy made to Abraham. In Genesis 15, Abraham is promised that his descendants would return to Palestine in the 4th generation. A very specific, generationally defined prophecy.
But history, according to the sources, tells a different story about the timing of the Exodus.
It does. The 3rd and 4th generations, so Abraham's grandsons and great-grandsons, they were the ones who actually entered Egypt and settled there. The generation that finally left Egypt during the Exodus, led by Moses, was the 6th generation.
So the historical timeline contradicts the specific promise recorded in Genesis.
It does. And this inconsistency is layered upon by what scholars call Egyptological anachronisms, evidence that the writers were using terminology and cultural assumptions from centuries later. Specifically, they seem influenced by the post-Babylonian exile era, which is long after the time of Abraham and Joseph.
It's that same pattern again, projecting their current reality back onto the past.
Exactly. And we've identified 4 key historical errors related to Egyptian life in the sources. First, the assumption that all Egyptian court officials were eunuchs. This reflects Babylonian court custom, not historical Egyptian fact.
Okay, what's second?
Second, the mummification timeline is off. Genesis 50 says that Joseph's father was embalmed in 40 days. However, historical and archaeological records are clear. The full historical periods for mummification, even the cheapest kind, was 70 days. The writer seems unaware of the actual process.
And third, this is probably the most obvious anachronism in this section, is the consistent use of the title Pharaoh for the king in the time of Abraham and Joseph.
This is a classic example of historical projection. The term Pharaoh literally means great house. the palace,
The building.
the building itself. Historically, it was only applied to the king himself relatively late, around the 18th dynasty. So using Pharaoh during the time of Abraham and Joseph is just historically incorrect.
It's like writing a book set in medieval England and referring to the king as Mr. President. The title simply didn't exist in that context.
Exactly. And the source material adds an interesting comparative point here. It notes that the Quran, when discussing the same historical periods, correctly uses the title king for Joseph's time and reserves Pharaoh specifically for Moses' later time.
And the final geographical anachronism. This one really cements the late authorship argument.
That's the mention of the land of Ramesses in Genesis. That name didn't exist until the 19th dynasty, specifically associated with the reign of Ramesses II, which is long, long after Joseph's era.
Okay, so having seen these profound questions around the Old Testament's compilation, we have to apply that same critical historical lens to the New Testament, the Gospels, the Epistles, everything that forms the second half of this scriptural foundation.
And here again, we see that the traditional clean attribution of authorship is deeply contested, even by early church figures, let alone later scholarship. The internal evidence in the New Testament texts suggests that same editorial and human hand at work.
Let's start with the Gospels, specifically Luke.
Critics, including early church figures like Jerome and the sect of Marcion, they question the first two chapters of Luke, the birth narrative. Well, the issue wasn't the content itself, but that it seemed to contradict the writer's stated goal in the book of Acts, which was to report Jesus' actions, what he began to do and to teach. So the initial chapters detailing the birth were seen as sort of theologically and narratively unnecessary for that stated mission.
And then we move to the Apostle Paul. He's arguably the single most influential figure in shaping the identity of Christianity. His letters are foundational, yet their authorship is far from settled.
The uncertainty is widespread. Our sources cite the Encyclopedia Britannica, which notes that some scholars believe 4 of Paul's key letters were actually written by his disciples maybe 2 decades after his death. Furthermore, Origen, who was a pivotal early Christian scholar, even questioned if Paul wrote anything substantial to the churches at all.
So that suggests that if you strip away the disputed epistles, the historical Paul may have written very little, which casts a lot of doubt on the direct apostolic authority of so much New Testament doctrine.
Exactly. And the Epistle to the Hebrews is famously disputed. It's been attributed to Paul, to Apollos, to Barnabas. There's no consensus. Even the book of Revelation is usually viewed as written by someone else, John the theologian, in Ephesus, an outsider, rather than the original Apostle John.
And that's based on things like stylistic differences.
Yes, and the way the author refers to the earlier apostles as if they were strangers.
You know, if these were divinely dictated texts, you'd expect absolute certainty, no internal markers of human fallibility, yet our sources point to specific instances where the writers use the language of estimation, of uncertainty.
These phrases are crucial because they stand in direct contrast to a claim of infallible word-for-word revelation. Take Luke 3.23 about Jesus' age. We read phrases like, about 30 years old and as was supposed.
About and supposed.
The inclusion of those words indicates human estimation and a lack of certain data. And this uncertainty apparently troubled early church scholars so much that they actually removed those phrases.
And took them out.
They did. The sources note they were excised in some English revisions of the Bible to present a more authoritative certain text. And we see it again in John 6.9b, where the writer is clearly estimating distance, about 25 or 30 stadia. This is the language of someone reporting a memory, an approximation, not recording an absolute divine truth.
Let's pivot now to the deep doctrinal conflicts Paul introduced. The sources paint him not just as an evangelist, but as a revolutionary who fundamentally separated Christianity from its roots as a Jewish sect.
This is the critical moment of doctrinal innovation. Early Jewish Christians, the ones centered in Jerusalem and led by Jesus' own family, figures like James, they viewed Paul as a traitor, an enemy. That's a quote from Cardinal Daniello. They saw him as subverting the original mission, which was Jewish reform.
So Paul essentially created a new religion, one tailored for the Gentile world.
That's the argument. Paul introduced core concepts that were absent in the earlier teachings and that defined Christianity as separate from Judaism. The big one being the doctrine of Jesus as the Son of God sacrificed for the inherited sin of Adam.
And this leads directly to the core dogma of atonement and fideism salvation through faith in the cross.
Yes. Paul argued that salvation was achieved through belief in Jesus' blood and the crucifixion. And what's fascinating here is the philosophical depth of this shift. The sources suggest Paul's doctrine was, well, a rational philosophical construct. It was designed to solve a theological paradox.
Which was?
How can God be perfectly just, demanding punishment for sin, and also perfectly merciful, granting forgiveness? The solution Paul engineered was to have Jesus, the Son of God, absorb the required punishment, thereby reconciling justice and mercy.
That's immense. A cornerstone of a global religion built, at least in part, on one individual's philosophical reconciliation of God's attributes, not necessarily on a direct teaching from Jesus himself.
It speaks volumes about the early theological development of the faith. It shows it was shaped by complex human reasoning and debate.
Now let's address one of the most powerful arguments against the factual accuracy of the New Testament, the prophecy of the imminent second coming.
This point cannot be overstated. Gospel writers and Paul repeatedly stressed that Christ's return was not a distant future event. It was immediate. It was expected within their own generation.
They were living in a constant state of impending apocalypse.
Absolutely. Matthew 16 states explicitly that some people standing right there, listening to Jesus, would not die until they saw the Son of Man coming. Matthew 10 reinforces this, telling the disciples they wouldn't finish preaching in all the cities of Israel before Christ returned.
And Paul staked his own life and the life of his contemporaries on this timing.
He did. Paul's writings place himself among the living who remain until the coming of the Lord, expecting to be snatched up without dying. He genuinely believed he would be in that group. And commentary cited from the Jesuit fathers confirms that Paul and the early church fundamentally expected this event to happen rapidly in their lifetime.
And since 2 millennia have passed and the event as it was described did not occur, these verses are presented as prophecies that, well, failed. The conclusion is that the writers were recording their immediate, fervent, but ultimately incorrect beliefs, rather than providing absolute divine foresight. We've established this complex, human-driven textual history. Now we have to shift to the argument that many core Christian doctrines were not fresh revelations, but rather borrowings. Here's where it gets really interesting, connecting these doctrines to the broader historical, mythological landscape. The source states it bluntly. Christianity did not abolish paganism, but adopted it.
This is the syncretism argument. It posits that many foundational Christian beliefs and rituals parallel or were assimilated from older pagan beliefs, especially those found throughout the Hellenistic and Mesopotamian worlds, and they predate Christianity by centuries.
So let's start with the theological heavy hitter, the Trinity.
Right. The idea of a divine triad, or Godhead, was not unique at all. Our sources document the concept of the Trinity long before the formalization of Christianity, represented in ancient temples by symbols like 3 heads on 1 body. The idea of a theological trinity was prominent in Zoroastrianism, and you found similar triune concepts among Assyrians, Hindus, and others.
So the human mind had already conceived of a 3-part God, centuries before the Council of Nicaea codified it for Christianity.
Exactly. It shows the concept was part of the common religious architecture of the ancient world. And the same thing goes for the birth narrative, the virgin birth and incarnation.
That concept is common across ancient savior myths.
It's widespread, in fact. The idea of a savior born of a virgin who descends to dwell among men and is deified after death. That was a familiar trope in Greek and Roman mystery cults. Take Horus, for example, who was believed to be born of the virgin goddess Isis.
And the title for Mary, Mother of God, came much later.
Much later. It was only formalized at the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE. And the sources suggest this formalization helped incorporate the powerful pre-existing cultural demand for a divine mother figure, cementing the adoption of a classical motif.
And the narratives surrounding the birth also share specific details, don't they?
They do. Our sources draw attention to the parallels in the actual circumstances of the births. So the notion of a star announcing a savior Buddhist star was called the Star of Christ in some traditions. And the repeated scenario of a divine child being born in a humble setting, often a cave, or being found by shepherds.
Which we see mirrored in the finding of Jesus in the manger.
Exactly. And it's paralleled by narratives concerning Bacchus, Asclepius, and Romulus.
The most detailed and, I think, striking parallel, though, is drawn between the central Christian drama, the Passion narrative, and the ancient Babylonian myth of Baal, or Tammuz.
This is a powerful point of convergence because it connects the mythological borrowing directly back to the cultural influence of the Babylonian exile, which we mentioned earlier. Tammuz was an ancient Babylonian fertility and resurrection god. He was central to Mesopotamian religion.
And what was the core myth of Tammuz?
Tammuz was a god believed to have been killed for the salvation or fertility of humanity, who then rose from the dead and ascended. His annual death and resurrection became a central focus of seasonal ritual.
And the sources draw 9 specific parallels between the Passion of Christ and the myth of Tammuz. What are some of the most compelling points of overlap?
The list includes the Savior being attacked after a trial, being led to execution on a hill, being guarded in a tomb, and very specifically, the mothers weeping at the tomb.
And that last point has a strong link back to Jewish texts themselves.
A very strong link. Ezekiel 8.14 explicitly mentions women in Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz. And crucially, the final parallel is that the Tammuz Resurrection Festival occurred in the spring, with him rising on a Sunday, matching the timeline of the Christian resurrection.
So critics argue that the Jewish people living among these Babylonian cults during the exile absorbed these deeply ingrained mythological structures, which later served as the narrative framework for the story of Christ.
It illustrates the mechanism of syncretism perfectly. It suggests that when the Jewish writers returned home and began compiling their traditions, they may have, maybe unconsciously or perhaps consciously, incorporated aspects of the Babylonian cosmological framework into their religious texts.
And beyond high doctrine, shared rituals also point to pre-Christian roots, particularly baptism and penance.
Right. Baptism, or lustration, was a common purification right across the ancient world long before John the Baptist. It was practiced in ancient Egypt, in Greece, where it was central to the Eleusinian mysteries, in Rome, India, even Mongolia. It was universally understood as a physical and spiritual cleansing, often symbolizing a second birth.
And in the Christian context, the purpose varies widely, but it's often tied to the forgiveness of sin.
Yes. Evangelicals might see it symbolically, but Orthodox and Catholics see it as a real spiritual rebirth that cleanses original sin. And the critical argument cited by our sources here is that if baptism alone is sufficient to truly forgive sins, it fundamentally undermines the doctrinal necessity of Christ's blood sacrifice on the cross. It raises a serious internal theological contradiction.
And finally, penance or confession and its economic evolution.
Penance is defined as concession to a priest to receive absolution. The historical development of this sacrament, the sources note, led directly to the sale of indulgences. This notorious practice was leveraged by popes as a massive financial scheme, famously to fund huge building projects like new churches. The sources characterize this as explicitly leveraging salvation for financial gain.
So the deep dive has shown us that the texts themselves are documents shaped by human hands, error, contradiction, and cultural context. As we move into the final section, we have to look at the historical consequences of what happens when religious institutions take these complex, edited texts and enforce them as a singular, infallible truth.
We begin with the most basic problem, the internal theological and textual conflicts that just can't be resolved, starting with whether humans can see or hear God.
We have clear instances where the Torah says God cannot be seen, yet people are recorded as seeing him.
Right. Exodus 33 says definitively, "No one can see me and lives." Yet elsewhere, the text says the elders of Israel saw God. Jacob saw God and named the place Peniel. Isaiah saw the Lord sitting on a throne. These are irreconcilable claims about God's visibility.
And the same contradiction exists for God's voice.
John 5.37 quotes Jesus saying, "No one has ever heard God's voice or seen his form." This strongly implies the voice is inaccessible. Yet the Torah in Deuteronomy clearly states the Israelites did hear God's voice speaking from the fire at Horeb. These conflicts just demonstrate the multi-layered nature of the source material.
We also find contradictory teachings attributed to Christ himself, which creates deep ethical confusion for followers.
Take the stance on who is a friend and who is an enemy. Mark 9:40 quotes Jesus saying, "He who is not against us is for us." It's a philosophy of acceptance, of broad alliance.
But that's flatly contradicted by a verse in Luke.
Yes, Luke 11.23, which states, "He who is not with me is against me," a philosophy of sharp division and exclusion.
And the most profound ethical conflict revolves around the treatment of enemies. It goes from ultimate charity to ultimate violence.
In Luke 6, you have the command to love your enemies and bless those who curse you. This is the foundation of Christian charity. However, Luke 19 contains the parable where the king commands, "But as for those enemies of mine, bring them here and slaughter them in front of me."
Wow.
The sources view this as two irreconcilable, diametrically opposed ethical instructions attributed to the same sacred figure.
And beyond outright conflict, the sources show clear evidence of scribal alteration, interpolation, where later writers changed earlier accounts, often to heighten divinity or to retroactively fulfill a prophecy that wasn't there.
The relationship between the Gospels of Mark and Matthew is often cited for this. Matthew frequently modifies Mark's account, for instance, to heighten Christ's divinity, Mark records Peter's confession simply as, "You are the Christ."
But Matthew adds to it.
Matthew elevates this to, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
Matthew also seems keen on proving Jesus fulfilled prophecy, even if the prophecy didn't actually exist.
Exactly. Matthew 2.23 claims the prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus was called a Nazarene, yet our sources confirm that this specific prophecy is not found anywhere in the books of the prophets. It appears to be an interpolation designed to justify a theological claim.
And the 3 days and 3 nights error remains one of the most cited chronological inaccuracies because it's just mathematically verifiable.
Matthew 12 claims Jesus would be in the ground 3 days and 3 nights, like Jonah. But the sources correctly point out the historical timeline. Death on Friday afternoon, burial Friday night until resurrection before dawn on Sunday, that is only 1 full day and 2 nights, not 3 days and 3 nights. It shows Matthew's claim was factually incorrect based on the Passion narrative's own timeline.
These textual issues set the stage for the massive historical consequences when institutional religious authority demands that these texts are literally infallible. This brings us to the suppression of intellect and persecution.
The sources document a period where the early church promoted a clear hostility toward independent learning. The concept that ignorance is the mother of piety became influential, and public education outside of strictly ecclesiastical control was severely curtailed.
And this hostility led to the persecution of philosophers and scientists whose observations contradicted theological interpretations of the text.
The infamous example cited is the murder of Hypatia, the female mathematician and philosopher in Alexandria in the 5th century. She was brutally murdered by a mob led by Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. Her body was mutilated and burned, and Cyril faced no consequence. The sources note that this event cemented a dangerous doctrine. The end justifies the means.
And other scientists faced severe punishment simply for explaining natural phenomena through physics.
Duromanius, for example, was burned for stating that the rainbow was caused by the reflection of light through water droplets, a physical explanation, not God's weapon. The claim of a round earth, which was well known to Muslim scholars during the Abbasid Caliphate, caused immense theological turmoil in Christendom for centuries.
And then Galileo, of course.
Galileo was condemned later for supporting astronomical claims that contradicted Scripture. And this opposition extended even into critical areas like public health and medicine.
Right, they opposed inoculation.
Yes, which was introduced to Europe from Constantinople in the 18th century. They saw it as interference with divine providence. They similarly opposed the use of pain relief during childbirth, citing the curse in Genesis. "In pain you shall bring forth children," arguing that pain relief interfered with God's punishment.
This intellectual suppression then culminates in the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition.
The Inquisition, active from 1481 for over 3 centuries, was a tribunal dedicated to using torture to extract confessions of heresy from anyone suspected of deviating from Catholic dogma. The sources detail the scale of persecution, highlighting the vast number of people judged and condemned.
And the Inquisition was also instrumental in the expulsion and forced conversion of non-Christians.
It ruthlessly targeted Muslims and Jews in Spain, resulting in the notorious expulsions of 1492 and 1502. This history is presented as the ultimate consequence of an institution asserting absolute, infallible authority over truth, resulting in systemic oppression.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize the findings of this massive deep dive into the provided source material? We've navigated centuries of textual evolution and conflict, seeing claims that challenge the most fundamental traditional assumptions about these sacred texts.
We've seen that critical scholarship suggests the Torah was a compiled, edited work completed centuries after Moses. We saw the evidence, the anachronisms, the internal contradictions like the Ammonite land issue. We've seen hard data discrepancies, census counts off by hundreds of thousands, chronological impossibilities.
Yeah, like the Basha and Asa timeline, and the historical inaccuracies concerning ancient Egypt.
Then we observed the New Testament under scrutiny. We noted disputed authorship for key Pauline epistles, the language of human uncertainty used by the evangelists, and the foundational doctrinal split created by Paul's philosophical system of atonement.
And most powerfully, we analyzed that failed prophecy regarding the imminent second coming, which was expected within the lifetime of the original apostles.
And we explored the powerful argument for syncretism, the thesis that foundational Christian doctrines like the Trinity, the virgin birth, and the entire Passion narrative bear striking mythological parallels.
Specifically referencing that 9-point overlap with the ancient Babylonian myth of Tammuz, suggesting an adoption of existing mythological structures.
The takeaway for you, the learner, is that ancient religious texts are incredibly complex living documents. They bear the clear marks of historical editing, theological development, human error, and profound cultural influence. This study demands that we critically engage with the texts themselves, distinguishing between verifiable historical record, evolving tradition, and established doctrine.
Now, the sources we reviewed conclude by offering the Quran as a comparative example, arguing it avoids these specific issues of textual contradiction and human intervention. And setting aside that specific conclusion, the broader implication of this study remains critical. Given the overwhelming evidence of human intervention and the resistance to intellectual inquiry, the burning of scientists for explaining light, the systematic suppression of ideas like the round earth, we are left with a question. What are the ultimate standards we should apply when determining the integrity of any revealed text, regardless of tradition? And does the historical enforcement of doctrine through oppression and hostility to observable facts fundamentally undermine the claim to spiritual authority of the institutions enforcing that doctrine? That is the provocative thought we leave you to mull over long after this deep dive is done.
चलें, आज हमारे पास एक बहुत ही दिलचस्प और कुछ हद तक मुतनाज़ा दस्तावेज है
जी।
उसका नाम तहरीफ.doc है और ये बाइबल की तारीख, उसके मतन और असलियत पर कुछ बहुत बड़े दावे करती है।
बिल्कुल।
तो हमारा मकसद किसी की हिमायत या मुखालफत करना नहीं, बल्कि सिर्फ ये समझना है कि इस दस्तावेज में क्या दलाइल पेश किए गए हैं।
जी, और ये देखना कि वो अपना मुकदमा बनाती कैसे है।
बिल्कुल। तो मैं ये देखने के लिए बहुत पुरजोश हूँ कि इसमें क्या है।
अच्छा, तो ये दस्तावेज जो है ये तफ्तीश का आगाज एक बहुत ही बुनियादी जगह से करती है, खुद बाइबल के नाम से।
नाम से?
वो कैसे?
उसका कहना है कि वक्त के साथ साथ बाइबल के तराजम के जो उन्वानात हैं वो भी बदलते रहे हैं।
अच्छा।
जैसे अंग्रेजी में जो किताब पहले सिर्फ द बाइबल कहलाती थी वो बाद में द रिवाइज स्टैंडर्ड वर्जन हो गई। उसी तरह फ्रांसीसी में ला सेंट बाइबल से ला बीबले दे जेरूसलम हो गई और जर्मन में डी हाइली के बाइबल सिर्फ दी बाइबल रह गई। तो दस्तावेज का पहला नुक्ता ये है कि अगर उन्वान ही इतना बदल रहा है तो क्या मतन भी?
बिल्कुल। तो क्या मतन भी बदला होगा? ये एक बहुत दिलचस्प इब्तिदा है।
सही।
और यहाँ से वो सीधा कदीम तरीन नुस्खों की तारीख में गोता लगाती है, क्योंकि असल शवाहिद तो वहीं से मिलते हैं।
ठीक है।
दस्तावेज दो बहुत अहम नुस्खों का जिक्र करती है। एक है नुस्खा सीनाया यानी कोडेक्स साइनेटिकस। कहा जाता है कि ये 4वीं या 5वीं सदी का है और इसकी कहानी खुद बहुत अजीब है।
क्या कहानी है?
इसके बारे में बताया जाता है कि इसके 730 में से तकरीबन 340 सफ़हात वो राहबों ने ला इल्मी में आग जलाने के लिए इस्तेमाल कर लिए थे।
क्या मतलब तारीख का इतना अहम हिस्सा नादानस्तगी में जला दिया गया?
जी, ये तो बहुत बड़ा नुकसान है।
इससे तो मतन के तहफ़्फ़ुज़ पर ही एक बहुत बड़ा सवालिया निशान लग जाता है।
बिल्कुल। ये जाहिर करता है कि इन कदीम मुतून का सफ़र कितना गैर यकीनी रहा है। दूसरा नुस्खा है नुस्खा इस्कंदरानिया कोडेक्स अलेक्जेंड्रिनस। ये 5वीं सदी का है और अब ब्रिटिश म्यूजियम में है। तो दस्तावेज कहती है कि जब इन कदीम नुस्खों का मवाजना आज के वर्जन से किया जाता है तो बहुत सी तब्दीलियां सामने आती हैं।
अच्छा, तो एक तरफ तो इन नुस्खों की फिजिकल तारीख खुद काफ़ी पेचीदा है, लेकिन दस्तावेज इससे आगे भी जाती है।
जी, वो एक कदम आगे बढ़कर कहती है कि अगर हम मतन को ही गौर से पढ़ें तो उसके अंदर भी कुछ ऐसे शवाहिद हैं जो इसकी असलियत के बारे में सवालात उठाते हैं।
ठीक है, खास तौर पर अहद कदीम के बारे में, यानी तौरात।
जी हाँ, दस्तावेज का एक मरकजी दावा ये है कि तौरात एक तवील अरसे तक मतलब गुमशुदा रही।
गुमशुदा? ये कैसे मुमकिन है?
मिसाल के तौर पर काजियों के ज़माने में ताबूत सकीना जिसमें तौरात के नुस्खे थे वो फ़लस्तीनियों के कब्ज़े में चला गया था। लेकिन इससे भी ज़्यादा हैरानकुन वाक़या बादशाह योशिया के दौर का है।
वो क्या था?
जब हैकल की मरम्मत हो रही थी तो वहां से इत्तेफाकन तौरात का एक नुस्खा मिला।
इत्तेफाकन?
जी, तो दस्तावेज ये नतीजा अख्ज़ करती है कि अगर बादशाह और काहनों को खुद मालूम नहीं था कि तौरात कहाँ है तो अवाम तक उसकी तालीमात कैसे पहुंच रही होंगी।
सही। ये तो मतन के गुम होने और दोबारा मिलने की कहानी है। लेकिन क्या दस्तावेज मतन के मवाद के बारे में भी कोई दावा करती है?
यहीं पर उसका सबसे मजबूत इस्तिदलाल सामने आता है।
अच्छा।
दस्तावेज का कहना کہنا ہے کہ تورات کی پہلی 5 کتابیں جنہیں حضرت موسیٰ سے منسوب کیا جاتا ہے وہ انہوں نے نہیں لکھیں۔
اوہ، یہ تو بہت بڑا دعویٰ ہے۔
جی، اور اس کے لیے وہ متن کے اندر سے ہی دلائل دیتی ہے، ایسی باتیں جنہیں انیکرونزمز کہا جاتا ہے۔
مطلب ایسی باتیں جن کا ذکر اس زمانے میں ممکن ہی نہیں تھا۔
بالکل
یعنی یہ کچھ ایسا ہی ہے جیسے کوئی کہے کہ اس نے شیکسپیئر کو آئی فون پر کال کی تھی۔
بالکل یہی مثال ہے۔ دستاویز کہتی ہے کہ تورات میں ایسے واقعات کا ذکر ہے جو حضرت موسیٰ کی وفات کے سینکڑوں سال بعد پیش آئے۔
کوئی مثال ہے اس کی؟
سب سے واضح مثال دان نامی شہر کا ذکر ہے۔ تورات میں اس شہر کا حوالہ موجود ہے، جبکہ تاریخ سے یہ ثابت ہے کہ یہ شہر حضرت موسیٰ کے زمانے کے بہت بعد آباد ہوا اور اس کا نام قبیلہ دان کے نام پر رکھا گیا۔
اچھا، تو سوال یہ ہے کہ حضرت موسیٰ اپنی تحریر میں ایک ایسے شہر کا ذکر کیسے کر سکتے تھے جو اس وقت موجود ہی نہیں تھا؟
بالکل یہی سوال ہے۔
یہ تو واقعی ایک بہت ٹھوس نکتہ ہے۔ اچھا، تو اگر عہد قدیم کے متن پر اتنے سوالات ہیں تو عہد جدید یعنی انجیل کی صورتحال کیا ہے؟ کیا وہ مختلف ہے؟
دستاویز اس پر بھی بات کرتی ہے اور یہاں بھی وہ متن کے اندرونی شواہد پر ہی توجہ دلاتی ہے۔
ٹھیک ہے۔
اس کا کہنا ہے کہ انجیل کے مصنفین نے کئی جگہ ایسی زبان استعمال کی ہے جو خدائی الہام کے بجائے ایک انسانی تصنیف کا تاثر دیتی ہے۔
جیسے کہ؟
مثال کے طور پر لوکا کی انجیل میں حضرت عیسیٰ کی عمر کے بارے میں لکھا ہے کہ وہ نحو 30 سنہ یعنی تقریباً 30 سال کے تھے۔
تقریباً؟
جی، یہ لفظ تقریباً انسانی گمان کی طرف اشارہ کرتا ہے۔
ہو سکتا ہے مصنف صرف ایک اندازہ بتا رہا ہو۔
یہ ایک اچھا سوال ہے۔ دستاویز کا نقطہ نظر یہ ہے کہ الہامی کتاب میں اندازے یا گمان کی گنجائش نہیں ہونی چاہیے۔ وہ ایک اور مثال دیتی ہے یوحنا کے انجیل کے اختتام سے۔ وہاں مصنف کہتا ہے کہ اگر حضرت عیسیٰ کے تمام کام لکھے جاتے تو لستہ ازونو یعنی میں نہیں سمجھتا کہ دنیا میں کتابیں سما سکتیں۔
میں نہیں سمجھتا۔
جی، یہ خالصتاً ایک انسانی رائے اور مبالغہ آرائی ہے۔ تو یہ چھوٹے چھوٹے اشارے مل کر دستاویز کے مطابق ایک بڑی تصویر بناتے ہیں۔
ٹھیک ہے، تو دستاویز کا استدلال یہ ہے کہ متن کی زبان انسانی ہے، لیکن اس سے آگے بڑھ کر کیا وہ مسیحیت کے بنیادی عقائد کی تشکیل پر بھی کوئی بات کرتی ہے؟
بالکل، اور یہاں وہ پولس یعنی پال کو ایک مرکزی اور انتہائی متنازع شخصیت کے طور پر پیش کرتی ہے۔
پالس کو؟ لیکن وہ تو مسیحی تاریخ میں ایک مرکزی حیثیت رکھتے ہیں۔
جی، لیکن دستاویز کا دعویٰ ہے کہ حضرت عیسیٰ کے اصل حواری جو یروشلم میں مقیم تھے اور جن کی سربراہی حضرت یعقوب کر رہے تھے، وہ پولس کو ایک غدار سمجھتے تھے۔
غدار؟
جی، اور اس کی تعلیمات کو مسترد کرتے تھے۔
یہ تو بہت ہی بڑا دعویٰ ہے۔ تو پھر پولس کے نظریات غالب کیسے آ گئے؟
دستاویز کا استدلال یہ ہے کہ پولس نے مسیحیت کو یہودیوں کے ایک فرقے سے نکال کر ایک عالمی مذہب بنانے کی کوشش کی، اور اس کے لیے اس نے رومی اور یونانی عوام میں جو مقبول عقائد تھے انہیں مسیحیت میں شامل کر لیا۔
اچھا۔
دستاویز کے مطابق مسیحیت کے بنیادی عقائد جیسے حضرت عیسیٰ کا ابن اللہ ہونا، کفارے کا تصور اور صلیبی موت کا عقیدہ، یہ سب پولس کی متعارف کردہ تعلیمات ہیں،
نہ کہ حضرت عیسیٰ کی؟
جی، دستاویز کا یہی دعویٰ ہے۔
یہاں سے معاملہ واقعی اور بھی پیچیدہ ہو جاتا ہے۔ تو دستاویز یہ کہہ رہی ہے کہ یہ عقائد پولس نے خود نہیں بنائے بلکہ پہلے سے موجود مذاہب سے لیے؟
جی، یہ اس دستاویز کا سب سے دھماکہ خیز دعویٰ ہے۔
وہ کیسے؟
یعنی ٹرینٹی کا عقیدہ۔ دستاویز کہتی ہے کہ یہ تصور کوئی نیا نہیں تھا۔ قدیم فارسی، آشوری اور خاص طور پر ہندوستانی مذاہب میں یہ پہلے سے موجود تھا۔
ہندوستانی مذاہب میں؟
جی، ہندوستان میں برہما، وشنو اور شیو کی تثلیث ایک بہت پرانی مثال ہے۔
اور کماری سے پیدائش کے بارے میں کیا؟
یہ بھی تو ایک مرکزی عقیدہ ہے۔
دستاویز اس پر بھی بات کرتی ہے۔ اس کا کہنا ہے کہ کماری سے دیوتا کی پیدائش کا تصور بھی کئی قدیم مذاہب میں پایا جاتا تھا۔
اچھا۔
مصری دیوتا ہورس کی پیدائش کماری آئسس سے ہوئی، یونانی دیوتا پرسیوس، رومی بادشاہ رومیولس، ان سب کے بارے میں یہی کہا جاتا تھا۔
تو دستاویز کا اصل نقطہ یہ ہے کہ یہ کہانیاں شونیہ میں پیدا نہیں ہوئیں۔
بالکل۔
وہ اس ثقافتی اور مذہبی ماحول کا حصہ تھیں جس میں مسیحیت نے جنم لیا۔
تو یہ محض اتفاق نہیں بلکہ ایک ثقافتی تسلسل کی طرف اشارہ ہے۔
جی، اور سب سے زیادہ چونکا دینے والی مماثلت وہ بابل کی ایک قدیم کہانی سے پیش کرتی ہے، دیوتا بائل کی موت اور اس کے دوبارہ زندہ ہونے کی کہانی۔
بیل؟
جی، اس کہانی اور حضرت عیسیٰ کے صلیبی واقعے کے بیان میں جو مماثلتیں دستاویز نے گنوائی ہیں وہ واقعی حیران کن ہے۔
وہ کیا ہیں؟ ذرا تفصیل سے بتائیں۔
فہرست کافی لمبی ہے، دیکھیں، دونوں پر مقدمہ چلا اور سزائے موت سنائی گئی۔
ٹھیک ہے۔
دونوں کے ساتھ ایک اور مجرم تھا اور عوام کے کہنے پر اس مجرم کو معافی ملی۔ دونوں کی موت کے وقت آسمان پر اندھیرا چھا گیا اور زلزلہ آیا۔
یہ تو بہت مخصوص تفصیلات ہے۔
ابھی اور سنیں، مرنے کے بعد دونوں کی قبر پر پہرا دیا گیا تاکہ ان کے پیروکار لاش چرا کر دوبارہ زندہ ہونے کا اعلان نہ کر دیں۔
اچھا۔
اور آخر میں دونوں موسم بہار میں مردوں میں سے جی اٹھے۔
یہ تو تفصیلات کی حد تک ایک جیسی باتیں ہیں، مطلب یہ صرف ایک عمومی خیال نہیں بلکہ پورا بیانیہ ایک جیسا لگ رہا ہے۔
بالکل۔ تو دستاویز کے نقطے یہ نہیں ہے کہ دیکھو ایک اتفاق ہے، بلکہ یہ کہ یہ بیانیہ اس وقت کی ثقافت میں پہلے سے موجود تھا۔
یہ ایک بہت بڑا دعویٰ ہے۔ تو ان بیرونی مماثلتوں کے علاوہ کیا دستاویز بائبل کے اندر سے بھی کوئی تضاد دکھاتی ہے؟
جی، اپنے مقدمے کو مزید مضبوط کرنے کے لیے وہ اندرونی تضادات کی بھی نشاندہی کرتی ہے۔
جیسے کہ؟
ایک بہت سادہ سی مثال ہے حضرت سلیمان کے گھوڑوں کے استبلوں کی تعداد۔
ٹھیک ہے۔
کتاب سلاطین میں یہ تعداد 40,000 بتائی گئی ہے، لیکن کتاب تواریخ میں یہی تعداد صرف 4,000 لکھی ہے۔
40,000 اور 4,000، یہ تو بہت بڑا فرق ہے۔
جی، یہ ایک واضح تضاد ہے۔ ایک اور مثال تاریخی غلطی کی ہے۔ کتاب تواریخ میں لکھا ہے کہ حضرت سلیمان نے صحرا میں تدمر یعنی پلمائرا کا شہر تعمیر کروایا۔
اور اس میں کیا غلطی ہے؟
دستاویز کہتی ہے کہ آثار قدیمہ اور تاریخی شواہد سے یہ ثابت ہے کہ یہ شہر حضرت سلیمان سے صدیوں پہلے سے موجود تھا۔
تو یہ چھوٹی چھوٹی لیکن ٹھوس غلطیاں اور تضادات ہیں جنہیں دستاویز اپنے بڑے دعوے کی حمایت میں پیش کرتی ہے۔
بالکل۔ یہ سب دلائل پیش کرنے کے بعد دستاویز اپنے اختتام پر ایک بہت گہرے سوال کی طرف آتی ہے۔
اور وہ کیا ہے؟
وہ چرچ کی تاریخ کے اس پہلو پر روشنی ڈالتی ہے جہاں اس کا علم اور سائنس سے تصادم ہوا۔
اچھا۔
دستاویز ایک اصول کا ذکر کرتی ہے جو کلیسا میں ایک زمانے تک رائج تھا، الجہالتوں امت تقوی۔
الجہالتوں امت تقوی، اس کا مطلب؟
جہالت تقوی کی ماں ہے۔
یہ تو ایک بہت سنگین بات ہے۔
جی، اس کا مطلب یہ تھا کہ عقیدے کے لیے زیادہ سوال کرنا یا عقلی دلائل تلاش کرنا نقصان دہ سمجھا جاتا تھا۔ اسی سوچ کے تحت نئے سائنسی نظریات کو مذہب کے خلاف سمجھا گیا۔ جب یہ نظریہ پیش کیا گیا کہ زمین سورج کے گرد گھومتی ہے تو اسے کفر قرار دیا گیا۔
گیلیلیو کا واقعہ۔
بالکل، گیلیلیو جیسے سائنسدانوں پر مقدمے چلائے گئے، اور دستاویز ایک بہت ہی المناک واقعہ کا ذکر کرتی ہے، ہائپیشیا یعنی ہائپاٹیا کا۔
وہ کون تھی؟
وہ اسکندریہ کی ایک عظیم ریاضی دان اور فلسفی خاتون تھیں۔ انہیں صرف اس لیے قتل کر دیا گیا کہ ان کے خیالات کو کلیسا کے لیے خطرہ سمجھا گیا۔
تو اس ساری بحث کا خلاصہ یہ ہے کہ دستاویز صرف متن پر تنقید نہیں کر رہی، بلکہ یہ سوال بھی اٹھا رہی ہے کہ اس متن کی تشریح نے انسانی فکر اور تہذیب پر کیا اثرات مرتب کیے۔
بالکل، اور یہی وہ نقطہ ہے جو دستاویز ہمارے سوچنے کے لیے چھوڑ جاتی ہے۔ یہ ہمیں اس پر غور کرنے پر مجبور کرتی ہے کہ مقدس متون کی تشریح، ان پر مبنی اداروں اور علم و فکر کے ارتقاء کے درمیان کیا تعلق رہا ہے، اور
یہ تعلق آج کی دنیا میں کیا معنی رکھتا ہے۔
جی، آج کی دنیا میں جہاں معلومات اور سائنس کا کردار اتنا اہم ہو چکا ہے، یہ ایک ایسا سوال ہے جس کا کوئی آسان جواب نہیں۔